All right. Hello and welcome to the first session of the Better Citizens, Better World event today. This session is about the existential crisis in the Middle East. And our speaker is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, who is an absolute queen. If you're not familiar with her, you should be. But Reverend Dr. Cannon is the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace and an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Reverend Dr. Cannon formerly served as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Outreach for World Vision, U.S., on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., as a consultant to the Middle East for child advocacy issues for Compassion International in Jerusalem, and as the Executive Pastor of Hillside Covenant Church, located in Walnut Creek, California, and as a Director of Development and Transformation for Extension Ministries at Willow Creek Community Church in Barrington, Illinois. Cannon holds an MDiv from North Park Theological Seminary, an MBA from North Park University's School of Business and Nonprofit Management, and an MA in bioethics from Trinity International University. She received her first doctorate in American history with a minor in Middle Eastern studies at the University of California, Davis, focusing on the history of the American Protestant Church in Israel and Palestine, and her second doctorate in ministry and spiritual formation from Northern Theological Seminary. And she's also the author of several books, including the award-winning Social Justice Handbook, Small Steps for a Better World, and an editor of A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land. Her work has been highlighted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Chicago Tribune, Christianity Today, Leadership Magazine, The Christian Post, Jerusalem Post, EU Parliament Magazine, Huffington Post, and other international media outlets. So all of that to say, we are so privileged to have May with us today. And I just know this session is going to be amazing. So join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon.
Thanks, Hannah. It's good to be with you and with others. And I wish that we were gathered under different circumstances. You know, the topic that we'll be wrestling with the next 40 minutes or so is an existential crisis in the Middle East. I don't think that that's hyperbolic. I think what's happening now is an existential crisis, not only in the Middle East, but for us here in the United States as well. And honestly, if we are talking about what's happening in Israel, in Palestine, specifically in Gaza, and now in Lebanon, in large part, the U.S. has a critical role to play. The Biden administration had and does have the influence and the ability to be able to stop the ongoing crisis because we are weaponizing it. We are empowering it and allowing it to continue. So I want us to break that down, to talk about it more. I am going to use some slides. We're going to go through some maps, and we're going to talk about October 7th, a year ago, October 7th, 2023, a day that certainly changed history. It's not the day that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began, but it's a critical day in terms of this moment, in terms of understanding what's happening in the Middle East. So I'm going to seek to share my screen and start with some maps, start with, I'll just have you, if you can verbally confirm for me that you can see my screen, that would be helpful, Hannah.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, that's great. So I'm the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace. I hope we have the opportunity to talk a bit about the work that we do at CMEP. I wanted to start just by looking at this map that shows you, this is a contemporary map of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. It's actually all of the occupied territories. You'll see the Golan. If you can see my cursor here, the Golan is considered occupied territory by most of the world. It was occupied after the Six-Day War in 1967 from Syria. President Trump was the first US president to acknowledge the annexation of the Golan when there over the past year was a group of children that were killed on a soccer field. Many people thought those children were Israeli children because Israel annexed Golan. Israel considered those children Israeli. Those children were actually Druze children. Most of the children in that town, most of those families did not take Israeli citizenship. That actually happened here in the Golan Heights. The other areas I want to highlight for you are the occupied Palestinian territories, which includes East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, which is where the majority of the Palestinian population lives. Of course, Israel proper is this area here. If you're able to see my cursor, the population of Israel is now, I think it's 9 million. We used to say 8 million people in Israel. About 20% of the population of Israel are not Jewish citizens of Israel, the vast majority being Palestinian. So you have Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, and then you have Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And so I want to talk about what happened on October 7th, 2023. Again, not because that's when it began, but just because today in the news, today, many people say that, it was a day that changed history. I think it's a day that's critical to understand because of its significance, not because it's a starting point, but just because of its significance as a turning point, if you will. On October 7th, 2023, it's now become clear that there were several dozen female soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces who were serving as border guards along, this is the Gaza envelope. This area here is called the Gaza envelope. This is the Gaza Strip, of which there are more than 2 million Palestinians who have been living in what many call an open-air prison. I've heard it said, why do we call it an open-air prison when the 2 million people who live there have not been convicted of a crime? It's important to understand that Gaza was under a siege. It was under a blockade for more than 16 years before October 7th of last year. What that means is that the Israeli military had along the Mediterranean coast had boats and ships that limited fishing, that were limiting the ability for fishermen to actually be able to go out. Often the blockade would come in and limit the fishing to within 6 kilometers or even less. And so there was a blockade by sea. You have a border here that's a militarized fence. One of the things that happened on October 7th was that militarized fence actually stopped working. It was overrun on that day. It was breached more than 30 different times in multiple locations. But the population of Gaza prior to October 7th, it took more than 500 trucks every single week to keep the population of Gaza at a minimum of its nutritional level, with the minimum number of supplies for humanitarian needs, for food, for humanitarian supplies. So think about that number, 500 trucks a day prior to October 7th. Think about the fact that this population could not enter or exit without permits. The borders that were the primary borders for entering and exiting were Rafah here between Egypt, the Erez crossing, which is up here, was the primary entry point going in and out of Israel. And then there's the Kerem Shalom crossing here, which was the primary point for that now is one of the only points where trucks are allowed in and out for humanitarian supplies today. So on October 7th, you had female soldiers stationed near the Gaza border who were warning Israeli authorities for months about increasingly suspicious Hamas activity on October 7th. Their concerns were dismissed. And on October 7th, Palestinian militants, particularly Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they launched a land, sea, and air assault on Israel from the Gaza Strip. The October 7th attack resulted in the death of approximately 1,200 people, primarily Israeli citizens, making it the deadliest day on Israel since its independence. In addition to the deaths of about 1,200 people, more than 240 people were taken from this Gaza envelope area into Gaza as hostages. The next day, Israel declared war for the first time since 1973, which was the Yom Kippur War. And I think it's important to acknowledge that October 7th was a Shabbat. It was a Saturday. It also was one of the high Jewish holidays. It was on the Thanksgiving festival of Sukkot. Many of the Israeli soldiers that day were on leave. Others had been deployed on the northern border. And so on the day of the October 7th attacks, on many of the locations where the attacks took place, it took up to 7 to 8 hours for soldiers to arrive. And for there to be any reprieve on the locations where the attacks were taking place. The assault began at about 6:30 in the morning. There was a barrage of about 2,200 rockets that were launched at Israel in about just 20 minutes. During that time, Hamas used about half the number of rockets that were launched on Gaza. During all of the 2021 11-day conflict. And so the Iron Dome system became overwhelmed that day. And about 1,500 militants penetrated either the border here or came into Israel by sea or by air. And so it was considered, the worst attack on Israel again, since the Yom Kippur War. The militants disabled the communication networks, several of the Israeli military posts nearby. They attacked installations, entered civilian neighborhoods. And so what you see here on this picture is these are pictures of the kibbutzim, the local Jewish communities that are near the border where the attacks took place. I mentioned that the attacks breached the maritime border as well as there were a few motorized paragliders. About 1,200 people were killed, and then there also was a massacre at a music festival that was called the Nova Music Festival. That was largely the people who were killed there were Israeli civilians and foreign nationals. A March 2024 UN report found evidence that some of the people at the festival were sexually assaulted prior to being killed. Adding to the trauma was the fact that this was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. And so this is what began for what the world has now began to call the Israel-Hamas war. And the Israeli Defense Forces began to conduct airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. And that's a summary, a very, very quick and short summary of what happened on October 7th. After October 7th, very, very shortly after, Prime Minister Netanyahu almost immediately declared war on Hamas and said that the goal was the eradication of Hamas. And he, on behalf of the Israeli government, said that all water, food, gas, and electricity would be cut off from the entirety of the Gaza Strip, which is not only illegal according to international law, it is morally abhorrent. So you have 2 million people living in Gaza, the vast majority of which are children, the vast majority of which are not responsible for Hamas being elected into power. This siege on Gaza quickly became where no trucks and no food and no humanitarian assistance was allowed into Gaza. The first trucks did not enter into Gaza after October 7th for several weeks. And then the number of trucks that was allowed into Gaza was well under 100 trucks a day. Here we are a year into the conflict. You had what was a humanitarian crisis and a siege before October 7th. And you now have a population that the amount of trucks that was allowed in August and in September, these were the lowest numbers of humanitarian assistance allowed in within the last year. You have more than 50% of the population that are experiencing acute hunger. You have North Gaza, which was declared a famine a few months ago, and that's only on the humanitarian side of the conflict. Within the first few weeks after October 7th, you had more bombs dropped on Gaza than the entire number of bombs dropped on Afghanistan by the US in our war against Afghanistan in a year. And you have had complete and utter devastation. So I want us to keep going and talking about what happened in Gaza after October 7th. You had evacuation orders, 2.3 million people living in Gaza. One of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu declared was that there were numerous evacuation orders over numerous periods of time. And I'm doing a broad summary in like 20, 30 minutes because I want us to have time for questions. But you can see here the way that Gaza is separated by segments. North Gaza, Gaza City, that orange area there is called the Netzarim corridor. That's something that was created by the Israeli military. It is a road that was built. You can get from the kibbutzim outside of Gaza from Israel to the Mediterranean. It's 4 kilometers long. Gaza Strip is about 26 kilometers lengthwise, and at that narrow area, it's only 4 kilometers. That Netzarim corridor essentially completely cuts off North Gaza from South Gaza. In the first few days, Netanyahu called for an evacuation of the 1.4 million people. The vast majority of the population was living in the north, called for them to be evacuated to the south. So they moved to Deir al-Balah and to Khan Yunis. Later, there was an evacuation order where, again, that population was moved even further south from Deir al-Balah to then Khan Yunis. So the people in Gaza now, more than a year later, the vast majority have not only been evacuated once, they've been evacuated numerous times, some 7 to 10 times. When you look at the food insecurity, I began to talk about this. These are showing food insecurity from February 15th to March 15th. And then the food insecurity, these were projections from March to July. You can see how the red categories show the different levels of crisis. So this is based on a categorization system. That's a 5-point categorization system, with famine being the highest level of category. And you can see it's already been declared that North Gaza is at the most acute level. We already know that there have been deaths because of malnutrition. We already know that there are a number of children who have experienced mental deficits that are experiencing different levels of malnutrition. You can see that the entire Gaza Strip is at a state of emergency because of limited access to food. If you have questions later, I can pull these slides back up and we can look at them again. I wanted to just give some summary. These numbers are not the most recent. They're as of a few weeks ago, but they show you originally the numbers that were given on October 7th was that more than 1,200 people were killed that day. Later, Israel readjusted the numbers. And so these do not include the number of Israeli soldiers that have been killed in Gaza and now in South Lebanon, but the numbers are at least, you can see this is from September 17th. In Israel, the number of civilians killed at that point was 1,139. In Gaza, the number was at least 41,252. It's believed in Gaza because gas has been significantly limited. There has not been the ability to be able to remove rubble, that there are at least 10,000 people missing underneath the rubble. And so it's believed that in terms of conversations about death and the number of people killed, it's believed that the numbers of those killed in the Gaza Strip are actually very conservative numbers. These are also, it's really important to talk about how these are direct deaths. These are not indirect deaths. So if someone is injured from a bombing or injured and then doesn't die for several days, they're not included in these death toll numbers. In the occupied West Bank, and this is something that is not talked about enough, the death toll in the West Bank is the highest that it has been in decades. Since October 7th, there are more than 700 people who have been killed in the West Bank. The vast majority because of Israeli military incursions. There also have been a number killed because of violent settler attacks. So I'm just stop sharing my screen for a minute, if I can figure out how to do that. Did I stop sharing my screen?
You did. You're good.
Okay, now I don't know where you are. Let me see. So that's about 20 minutes. Let me just give a few more statistics, and then I'll open it up for questions. This is a more recent number in terms of the occupied West Bank. Of those killed in the West Bank, that number is now 742 people killed, with the number of children killed in the West Bank being 163 children. The number injured in the West Bank is 6,250. In terms of the overall summary in Gaza, more than half of the homes in Gaza over the last year have been destroyed, more than 80% of the commercial facilities, more than 87% of school buildings have been damaged or destroyed. The healthcare facilities, 17 of 36 hospitals are partially functional. 68% of road networks have been destroyed. 68% of cropland has been destroyed. And if you think that the devastation and destruction and massive civilian casualties are upsetting and horrific in their own right, I was just meeting with a high-ranking official who has a background in defense and security in Israel these past couple of days. And he said that the Israeli attacks on Gaza have created the perfect conditions for recruitment and radicalization into militancy, that there is such desperation and despair, there's such a lack of hope that if one of the things we've been talking to elected officials about is that there has been so much death and destruction that we would hope that our elected officials would stop the killing for the sake of children, for the sake of the next generation, for the sake of it's the right thing to do, for the moral cause. But that if elected officials will not call for an end to violence and death for the moral reason, that there are pragmatic reasons to call for an end to war. If it's not for the sake of Palestine, do it also for the sake of Israel, that it's in the best interest of Israel and the best interest of the United States to call for an end to war and to call for an end to violence. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is that the conditions that are being created are conditions that are only causing more harm to the future of Israel, to the future security of Israel. We talk about how one of the promises of the Israeli state was that military might and security would provide protection and safety for Jewish people in Israel. And if there is any lesson to be learned from October 7th, is that military might and violence does not provide safety and security, that actually peace is the only thing that will be able to provide that. And so that's something we've been talking about a lot over this past year. There's a lot of things I could share, and I feel like I am not doing justice in trying to summarize just the horrors of the past year and where we are today in such a short amount of time. You should know that over this past weekend, the U.S. did just issue a letter to the Israeli government saying it had been more than 2 weeks since a truck had been allowed into North Gaza. And so the U.S. government, I think the letter might have come public on Monday. The U.S. Sent a letter to the Israeli government saying that unless trucks were allowed and more humanitarian assistance were allowed into Gaza, that the U.S. would withhold weapons. They gave Israel 30 days to implement this. And so there was just 50 trucks were just allowed into North Gaza in the last, since that letter was just issued on Sunday. And there's been a lot of critique about why 30 days is being given. And so that is something that has just happened in this past week. There's a lot of other things we could talk about. We could talk about the fact that there was just an attack that was on a hospital, and one of the effects was that some of the displaced people who were living in tents caught on fire, and there was a video where a person was burned alive, and this did not get media attention. I mean, this was not like, the world is not in an uproar. And so we are hearing Palestinians say, like, literally, this is the first genocide that is happening on video in front of the world, and the world is not up in arms, and the world in large part is silent. And not only is it silent, you have countries like the United States that are continuing to send weapons and continuing to militarize. And so that's a part of the conversation as well. So I think I will stop there, and we can have some questions and some conversation, but that is a very, very, very broad and short and inadequate summary of what's happened the last year in Gaza.
Yeah. Thank you so much, May. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the comments. May, while we're waiting for some questions, is there anything you'd want to say maybe about the escalating violence in Lebanon and the role that plays in all of this?
Yes, and I will pull up some statistics because I just went through these today. I think one of the things that is not talked about in the news is that Lebanon has been going on also since the beginning of October. So there have been escalations between Hezbollah and Israel in South Lebanon, and in North Israel. Since the very beginning, there have been roughly 60,000 Israelis who were displaced and moved out of their homes, and 100,000 Lebanese in South Lebanon. I was just in Beirut in January. This was something we were talking about, villages in South Lebanon that were displaced. Nobody was talking about Lebanon then, even though there have been hostilities over the last year. Now that increased significantly. Israel launched, they would call preemptive attacks. They would say, I won't try to say what they would say, but Israel committed assassinations. They assassinated a high-ranking Hamas official. They assassinated the head of Hamas's political wing, and they assassinated the head of Hamas's political wing in Tehran, Iran, and then they assassinated the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, and in addition to a number of other key leaders. They also ignited, they had pagers. Hezbollah, one of the things Hezbollah did is that anyone that was affiliated within their network, there were pagers or walkie-talkies that were used within the Hezbollah network throughout Lebanon. And so this might be people who, were not involved in military activities per se, but were, distantly connected, and they might have a pager. And these pagers they had explosive devices in them. They went off, and so 2,000 or thousands of pagers exploded all across Lebanon. This was several weeks ago. And so these incidents happened, which escalated the situation between Hezbollah and Israel, and of course between Iran and Israel. And so the death toll now, that's what I was going to pull up for you, is to get the actual numbers. It'll take me a minute to do that. But the situation in Lebanon has escalated significantly since those attacks. Iran would say that they counterattacked just, I don't know when that was. I was in the region. It was just in the last 2 weeks. What's interesting about the Iranian attacks, you will hear that it was the worst attack on Israel. Iran coordinated those attacks with the United States and with Russia. So what I mean by coordinated is they told and let the US know that they were coming. And so a lot of what we hear in the media versus like what's happened is different. So that's a bit of a summary in that regard.
Thank you, May. We do have some questions. So the first one is, when you say the US sends weapons, can you describe that process a bit more? Is it a gift from one government to another, some kind of military trade, private business to government sales? Like what does that look like?
That's a great question, and it is so complicated. Oh my goodness. In the next couple of weeks, we are going to have a fact sheet that's coming out about that. We have been monitoring that, and even what's reported in the news and what we've been monitoring, the news contradicts itself in that regard. In general, under President Obama, there was an agreement where the US gives at least $3 billion plus per year in foreign assistance. The vast majority of that foreign assistance is foreign assistance that is money that is given to Israel, and then Israel uses that money to buy US weapons. So that is one of the main mechanisms. The other mechanism is that the US president has the ability as president to be able to agree to send arms if it is below a certain threshold. And so it's called below the congressional threshold. And so there are a ton of weapons. And there are articles about this where, and I don't know what that actual threshold is. It's so many millions of dollars. So President Biden can say, I'm going to send, this was one of them that I know did happen, where artillery, the guns that are being used, one of the things that happened is the Israeli government started to give Israeli settlers in the West Bank authority to be able to govern in the West Bank. And there was a question about, they started to actually give them weapons to be able to govern in the West Bank. And the question was, were they giving them weapons that were used from the US? This was a question. And so the artillery rifles that were being, the US sent a whole shipment of artillery rifles, for example. And so, the shipment was below the threshold. So that can be an executive order. So there are tons and tons of mechanisms by which weapons can be sent. And we have sent billions of dollars of weapons. And one of also a big issue is that part of why the death tolls are so high is that there have been what are called heavy bombs that have been used in Gaza, 500-pound bombs and 200-pound bombs that kill hundreds of people. And so one of the arguments that's often used is that Israel is a very large seller of weapons. They are also one of the largest distributor of drones. And it's often said that one of the reasons they are so successful in the selling of drones and the selling of weapons is because they're one of the few countries in the world that can say, we've used these weapons and we know they work, and they use them on Gaza.
Thank you so much, May. That was really helpful. Okay, another question is, as you meet Israeli officials, how would you describe the strength of the Israeli voices speaking out for peace?
The ones that are speaking out for peace are so strong. I think they are few but strong, few and mighty. There are one of the voices that comes to mind. One of the women who was killed on October 7th is a woman named Vivian Silver. She was one of the founders of a movement called Women Wage Peace. Her son was not engaged, as far as I know, as a peace activist. I think he was a therapist. He was in civil society. I don't really know what he did before October 7th. And he was one of the first voices in Israeli society calling for a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. And I can promise you, after October 7th, there were very few voices coming out of Israel that were calling for a ceasefire. And so for him, I'll get choked up. For Israelis to have experienced such a trauma. And, one of the things I did that I felt like I needed to do to seek to give witness was to watch the videos of the October 7th So I watched some of the videos of the massacres at the Nova Music Festival, and for someone to have lost their mother, a family member to that, and to still call for peace. The organization Combatants for Peace, those voices are just incredible. And I will say they're growing also.
It's encouraging to hear that they're growing. May, what would you say to people who want to get involved, who want to speak out, who want to advocate for peace, but maybe feel like their voice is too small, or they're just one person, or they don't know how to go about doing it?
I love that question. I'm going to share my screen again. So I think the idea that your voice is too small, it's our voices together that I think can really make a difference. And in that regard, what we've been talking about is standing in the gap. And this comes from a verse in Ezekiel that talks about standing in the gap. And so we've been saying, give, act, and pray. And so we have opportunities by which you can engage. We've been saying, give. A lot of people want to give to Gaza. They want to give to humanitarian assistance. They want to give to, that will make a physical difference on the ground. And, one of the main issues is getting products into Gaza is a huge issue. And so we're saying, yes, please give to organizations that are doing direct work on the ground, but give to organizations that are also doing advocacy, that are advocating for the actual, food to get there. And so give to organizations like ours, like Churches for Middle East Peace or other advocacy groups. There are tons of ways to take action, and that can be direct action, like engaging in prayer vigils. It can be direct action. We partner with groups like Christians for Ceasefire. We partner with a number of groups. We're trying to provide opportunities for action and engagement. And so there's lots of things we can talk about. One of my favorite things that's happened, that's still happening, was Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages, where people all over the world walked the length of the distance of Gaza in solidarity with Gaza in all 7 continents as a beautiful embodiment of solidarity, raising money, praying, raising awareness. And then praying. And so there's such a desperate need for prayer. And praying can be, writing prayers for our Prayers for Peace blog. There's such a need to write op-eds. One of the most powerful things you can do is write an op-ed for your local newspaper. And the smaller the newspaper, the better, and the more influence. I'm not kidding. And so we talk about educate, elevate, advocate as a way to engage. And so we have opportunities on our website. We have resources, small group studies, and then we have opportunities, that we're doing every single week. So this morning I did a live briefing where I'm still doing daily videos. Every single day we summarize the news of what's happening in the Middle East. And so we post those online, but Thursdays we do live briefings of what's happened in the last week in the Middle East. And then every Wednesday we gather and pray together. And so those are just some of the specific things people can do. Have us come to your churches, have us, talk to your communities. There's such a need for us to come together because the voice for those calling for a comprehensive permanent ceasefire to stop sending arms, particularly from the Christian community, is just not loud enough.
Yeah. Thanks, May. I actually have one more question. Sure. Real quick. And I just how do you keep hope? How do you move forward in a hopeful way in the midst of a situation that can just feel so hopeless?
Yeah. Well, I say often despair is the luxury of the privileged. And so I have friends in Gaza who I pray for every day, and my friends in Gaza are serving other people in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, if they're living through it, I have water every day. I have food every day. I just traveled for a month and came home to my house and my family, and like what privileges we have, right? And so gratitude, I think, is a sustaining force. But one of the things that gives me hope is the way that people in the region sustain themselves. I mean, I just spent several weeks there, and I was with these Palestinian women. We're getting ready. I would invite people to consider coming. If you want to come, we have a trip that's going in November. Men and women are traveling, and we have a women's event that's called End Still We Rise. And we're planning on traveling into Amman and doing this event, and Hannah will be there with us, and we'll be together in Jericho. And if we're able to travel and cross the border, between Jordan and the West Bank, we will go. And if Jericho is closed, we will do it in Bethlehem. And I was speaking with these women, and they said, we just want to live. And I said, do you want us to still do this event? And they said, like, their attitude was kind of more now than ever. Like, if we can't live now through this, then then what's living all about, kind of thing. And that gives me hope. I mean, children laughing, you see these pictures of these kids in Gaza who have nothing, and they're still smiling and laughing, right? And they're still, and I think that glimpse of humanity in the midst of such suffering, I think, is so hopeful.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you, May. Yesterday, I found this account on Instagram. I heard about it in a lecture, and I don't remember the name, but it's people doing circuses in Gaza. And so they're teaching these children how to juggle and how to do like circus tricks. And it's beautiful. So it's like Gaza circuses or something like that. So go forward. So thank you so much for being here with us, May. We're so thankful to have you. And I'm just so thankful for your voice and your leadership. And just blessed by you today.
Thank you.
All right. I hope that you all learned something. And I hope that you all can join us for the 2 remaining sessions for today. If you come back in about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we have another session tonight at 5:30, which is a panel on single issue voting. So hope to see you all later. Thanks. Bye.